The wind was a blade against her cheek, shearing away what little warmth remained in her blood. Each ragged breath she drew was an agony of ice crystals in her lungs, a desperate, failing currency spent on one more step. The forest was a gray, indifferent purgatory of skeletal aspens and stoic pines burdened with an early, spiteful snow. Her vision swam, the trees bleeding into one another, their sharp edges blurring into a hazy watercolor of despair. There was only the pain, a hot, insistent throb in her thigh that pulsed in time with her frantic heart, and the cold that seeped into her bones, promising a final, silent peace she could not yet afford to accept. She remembered the crack of the rifle, the searing tear of the bullet that had grazed her leg, and the shouts that followed, coarse and hungry on the biting air. They were still behind her. She could feel their presence like a pressure against her back, a relentless weight that bent her forward. How long had she been running? Hours? A day? An eternity measured in stumbling footfalls and the rhythmic drip of her own blood staining the pristine snow a series of dark, damning blossoms. Her fine wool coat, a useless relic from another life, was torn and snagged, offering little protection. The world she had fled, a world of gilded cages, of soft hands and cruel whispers, had no currency here. Here, survival was the only wealth and she was bankrupt. A game trail, faint but present, offered a whisper of guidance. She followed it, her legs leaden, her mind a flickering lantern against the gale of exhaustion. Then she saw it, less a structure and more a suggestion of one. A low sod roof built into the side of a steep hill, almost perfectly camouflaged by overgrown hawthorn and shadow. A trapper's hut.
A hermita's den. Agrave.
It didn't matter. It was shelter. With the last dregs of her strength, she clawed at the rough-hewn wooden door, finding it unlatched. It swung inward on groaning leather hinges, revealing a cavern of profound darkness. The scent of wood smoke, old and faint, clung to the air within, a phantom promise of warmth. She fell more than crawled across the threshold, pulling the heavy door shut behind her, plunging herself into a near-total blackness that was both terrifying and a profound relief. The world outside, and the men in it, vanished. Her body, finally granted permission, surrendered. She lay on the hard-packed earth floor, the throbbing in her leg a distant drum, and let the darkness take her. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn but as a series of jarring fragments. A sliver of light from a crack in the door. The sound of a heavy footstep outside, crunching on snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt into the shadows, but her body refused to obey. The door creaked open, and a silhouette filled the frame, immense and dark against the blinding white of the snow-covered world. It blocked the light, plunging her back into darkness. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. He had followed the trail, her trail. He had found her. She squeezed her eyes shut, a child's defense against a monster. She heard the soft thud of a deadfall rabbit being dropped onto a table, the rustle of a heavy coat being removed. The air stirred, carrying his scent. Pine needles, cold air, and something else, something elemental and wild. He did not speak. She listened to the deliberate, unhurried sounds of his movements. The scrape of a flint and steel, the whisper of tinder catching flame. A soft, orange glow bloomed in the small stone hearth, pushing back the shadows, and she risked a glance. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a beard that was more frost than color. His face, illuminated by the nascent fire, was a map of hard living, carved with lines of solitude and grim competence. He moved with a quiet economy, every action purposeful. He stoked the fire, adding small pieces of wood until it crackled with life. Then he turned, and his eyes found hers in the gloom. They were pale, the color of a winter sky, and held no discernible expression. Not cruelty, not pity, not even surprise. It was the calm, assessing gaze of a man accustomed to observing the creatures of the wild. She was simply one more, a wounded doe that had stumbled into his den. Her breath hitched, a tiny, betraying sound in the silence. He looked at the bloody tear in her leggings, then back to her face. He still said nothing. He turned away, tending to his fire, giving her a moment to absorb the terrifying fact of her discovery. Her life, which she had fought so desperately to save, was now utterly in his hands. He let her be for a long time, so long that the warmth from the fire began to lull her back towards the edge of unconsciousness. She fought it, clinging to awareness, knowing that to sleep was to surrender completely. He moved to the small, rough table and began to skin the rabbit with a practiced efficiency that was both fascinating and unnerving. When he was done, he wiped the knife on a cloth and approached her. She flinched, pressing herself against the cold earthen wall. He stopped a few feet away, holding not the knife, but a wooden bowl of water. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, and set it on the floor beside her. His gaze met hers again briefly before he rose and returned to the hearth, his back to her once more. The gesture was so simple, so devoid of threat, that it disarmed her. Thirst was a fire in her throat. Slowly, her trembling hands reached for the bowl. She drank, the cool water a balm to her parched insides. He had not hurt her. He had not questioned her. He had given her water. It was a fragile foundation, but it was the first stone of something other than terror. For hours, a strange, silent domesticity filled the small cabin. He cooked the rabbit in a pot over the fire, the savory smell filling the small space and making her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she possessed. He ate his portion from a wooden plate, then ladled some of the broth and a few pieces of meat into her bowl. He set it down beside her, just as he had with the water, and retreated to his side of the room. She ate, the warm broth a miracle that spread through her limbs, chasing away some of the deep, cellular cold. She watched him over the rim of the bowl. He was mending a tear in a leather glove, his large hands surprisingly nimble. He seemed utterly contained within himself, a man who had pared life down to its barest essentials. He was a part of this landscape, as much as the stones and the ancient pines. She was the intrusion, the disruption, the bloody track that had led trouble to his door. The thought sent a fresh spike of fear through her. It wasn't just him she had to fear. It was what she had brought with her. Later, when the light outside had faded to a deep, bruised purple, he rose. He took a tattered wool blanket from a wooden chest and walked towards her. Again, she tensed, but he simply draped it over her, his calloused fingers brushing her shoulder for a fraction of a second. The touch was impersonal, yet it was the first human contact she'd had in days that wasn't violent. He banked the fire for the night and settled himself on a stool on the far side of the hearth, his back against the wall, a long rifle resting across his lap. He was not sleeping. He was watching, guarding. But what was he guarding? Her, or himself from her? The following day passed in much the same way. A silent routine of survival. He left for hours, returning with firewood. He never strayed far. She could sometimes hear the rhythmic chunk of his axe splitting wood. He brought her more broth, and a poultice of herbs he'd crushed, its pungent, earthy smell filling the cabin. With a detached gentleness, he indicated her leg. Panic flared, but exhaustion and the quiet authority in his posture won out. Trembling, she exposed the wound. It was ugly, inflamed, and deep. Without a word, he cleaned it with a cloth dipped in hot water and applied the poultice. His touch was firm, clinical. He bound it with a strip of clean linen. The relief from the cool herbs was immediate. He had tended to her as he would a sick animal, a responsibility he had accepted simply because it was in his care. That afternoon, she saw him standing in the open doorway, staring out at the snow. He was not looking at the trees or the sky, but at the ground, at her tracks from 2 days before, now partially obscured by a fresh dusting of snow. He was studying the direction from which she had come, his brow furrowed in thought. He was putting the pieces together. The torn finery, the wound that was not from a fall, the terror in her eyes. He was a man who read signs for a living, and she was a sign he was beginning to understand. She saw the calculation in his posture, the slight tensing of his shoulders. He was weighing the risk she represented against the dictates of his own conscience. He might help her, but he might also decide the risk was too great. He could cast her out, or worse, he could ride to the nearest settlement and report the strange woman he'd found, hoping for a reward or simply to absolve himself of the trouble. Her throat went dry. She had to stop him. She had to make him understand. Pushing herself up on one elbow, the effort making her head spin, she found her voice. It was a wretched thing, a dry, rasping whisper, hardly more than a breath. Don't. He turned his head slowly, his pale eyes fixing on her. If you tell anyone, she whispered, the words scraping her raw throat. If they find out I'm here, they'll kill us. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a slight narrowing of his eyes. She had bound his fate to hers with her words. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached out, took hold of the heavy wooden door, and pulled it shut, plunging the cabin back into its firelit intimacy. He slid the heavy wooden bar across it, the sound echoing in the stillness like a final judgment. An answer. The storm arrived that night, a howling banshee that threw itself against the small cabin. The wind shrieked through the pines, and snow fell in a blinding, world-obliterating curtain. The cabin, which had felt like a cage, now felt like a fortress, the only point of stillness in a universe of violent chaos. The blizzard raged for 2 days, imprisoning them together. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the hut, to the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. The enforced proximity changed something between them. The silence was no longer one of wary distance, but of shared circumstance. She watched him work, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, his movements patient and precise. He watched her, too, in quiet, fleeting glances, as if still trying to solve the puzzle of her existence. On the 2nd day of the storm, she woke from a feverish sleep, crying out, a nightmare, vivid and terrifying, of the men's faces, of their cruel laughter. He was there in an instant, a cup of water in his hand. He didn't speak, just knelt beside her until the trembling subsided. They will not find us, he said. His voice was rough from disuse, a low rumble like stones shifting underground. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Promise. My father, he promised me to a man, she found herself saying, the words spilling out into the quiet space between them. A cruel man, powerful, could not. I ran. He listened, his gaze steady on the fire. He did not press for more. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of his head. He understood. Or perhaps he did not need to understand the particulars, only the universal truth of a creature fleeing a predator. That night, the storm broke. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and in the morning, the world was remade, buried under a thick, seamless blanket of white. All tracks were gone. Hers, theirs. It was as if the world had been wiped clean, offering a new, blank page. He took his rifle and went out. To hunt, was all he said. But she knew he was also scouting, reading the new snow for any sign of his own. When he returned hours later, his face was grim. Riders, he said, his voice clipped. 5 of them, past north, down in the valley. They're searching. The cold that gripped her had nothing to do with the winter air. They hadn't given up. They will not look up here, he continued, his tone reassuringly certain. The snow is too deep. They think the storm would have finished anyone caught in it. He was right. Her pursuers were hunters of men, not of the wild. They would not possess the skills or the sheer will to challenge this unforgiving landscape. Her greatest enemy, the wilderness, had become her greatest protector. And this man, this silent stranger, was its warden. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, one of quiet partnership. Her leg began to heal, the deep ache dulling to a manageable throb. She was able to move around the small cabin, taking on small tasks. She learned to mend his clothes with the needle and thread he kept in a wooden box, her stitches neat and even, a skill from a life that seemed a world away. She ground dried herbs with a stone mortar and pestle. She learned to bank the fire and to listen to the language of the forest, the snap of a frozen branch, the call of a snow-laden crow. He taught her, not with words, but through action, leaving tasks for her to see and to do. He would bring in a pail of snow and set it by the fire to melt for water. The next day, he would simply leave the empty pail by the door. She would fill it. It was a silent conversation, a language of shared survival. One evening, as he cleaned his rifle by the firelight, she spoke. "I don't know your name." He paused, looking up from his work. "Silas. I am Ilara." The names hung in the air between them, simple and solid. They were no longer a man and a woman, a rescuer and a victim. They were Silas and Ilara. The change was subtle but profound. A recognition, a beginning. She no longer looked at him and saw a potential threat, but a bulwark against the world. She saw the quiet integrity in the way he cared for his tools, the deep respect he held for the forest that sustained him, the unspoken kindness in his every gesture toward her. He had taken on her danger without question, had protected her with a steadfast, silent resolve. Weeks bled into a month. The deep winter settled over the mountains, locking them in its icy embrace. Ilara grew stronger. The hunted look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet resilience. The pallor of her skin gave way to a healthy flush from the cold and the work. She learned to set simple snares near the cabin, and her heart swelled with a fierce, unfamiliar pride the day she caught a small snowshoe hare. She had provided. She was not helpless. Silas had given her a nod of approval that felt more rewarding than any praise she had ever received in her old life. One afternoon, standing in the doorway of the cabin, she looked out over the vast, snow-covered expanse. The landscape that had once seemed so terrifying now looked beautiful in its stark, uncompromising purity. It was a hard land, but it was honest. It did not lie or dissemble. It demanded strength, and in return it offered a clean, simple existence. She had not merely been hiding here. She had been healing, not just her body, but her spirit, which had been broken by a life of suffocating expectations. Here there was only one expectation: to endure, and she had. She was enduring. Silas came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the setting sun paint the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and violet. The world was vast and cold, but in that small, sheltered space, they had carved out a pocket of warmth, a fragile sanctuary built on unspoken trust and shared hardship. "They will not come back before the thaw," he said, his voice a low murmur. "When the passes are clear, you can go." She turned to look at him, at his weathered face and the steady calm in his pale eyes. Go where? Back to a world that had tried to crush her? The thought held no appeal. The freedom she had craved was not in escape, but in self-reliance. She had found a measure of it here, in this unforgiving wilderness, with this silent, solitary man. "The thaw is a long way off," Ilara said, her voice clear and steady. She looked back at the mountains, at the coming twilight. For the first time since she had fled, she was not thinking about survival. She was thinking about living. The past was a ghost, and the future an unwritten page. But for now, here, in the heart of the immense, silent winter, she was no longer running. She was home.